Airplane pilots of Reddit, what was your biggest we're all fricked up moment that you survived and your passengers didn't notice? Not a pilot but a flight attendant. We landed. Everything went smoothly. As we're deplaning, the pilot steps out of the flight deck and goes, "Wow, I'm glad we made it. We lost 2 hydraulics on the way down." Mine is from many years ago when I was a student pilot. I was 14 I think at the time. I had about 15ish hours done and getting close to soloing for the first time, but still had a few hours and more landings to practice. I was doing some basics and getting ready to come back with my instructor to practice some touch and goes for a bit. Coming back through, we had to pass through DTW's Bravo airspace, means need permission to go through it. A few minutes before I was about to call for permission, my instructor got really quiet. I looked over at him and he looked really bad. I thought he was going to puke, so looking for a bag. But then I notice he isn't breathing. I figure out where I am at and call up DTW approach. Declare a medical emergency and that my instructor was not breathing. I also told them I am a student and never landed on my own before, and never in a large airport. Detroit approach was amazing at helping me. They gave me an option for DTW or Willow, but Willow would have added a good 5-10 minutes since I was coming in from the SE. Opted for DTW and they were great at giving me vectors while also getting the big jets out of the way. I remember hearing them tell several planes to go around and several more into a hold. Anyway, did my approach and made the most butter smooth landing I have ever made in my life, even till this day. Ambulance was right there on the taxi waiting for me. Turns out my instructor, who was only 25, had a heart attack. He ended up being okay. All in all, from first call to him in the ambulance was less than 10 minutes thanks to ATC and DTW Tower. This is a great story. I really hope you continued flying because you seem to work well under pressure, which is like the quality of person I want to fly planes. I'm a CFI at this point and I'm flying with a student. We see a spider in the cockpit. I'm okay with spiders but I don't want it distracting the student, so I mash it. Student missed the spider but saw my movement and asked what it was. I responded it was a spider. I killed it as I'm glancing into the backseat area. I managed to casually add, "Why are you scared of spiders?" without the student noticing the break in the sentence. Turns out the student is scared of spiders. For the rest of that flight I squished spiders behind my student's back as they came forward from the nest I had just spotted in the back of the plane. He never knew. I was in the process of getting my PPL, private pilot license, and I was flying circuits solo. Before I took off, the CFO of the flight school asked me if I was sure it was a good idea to fly. It's pretty windy. I was flying a Cessna 152 on a day with wind pushing 15 kts and turbulence around 20. I honestly don't know what I or anyone at the flight school was thinking letting me, 16 years old, take off. Anyways, a few bumpy circuits go by with no problem. I actually got some great practice landing in turbulence. So the last circuit of the day, I'm on final with full flaps doing the absolute minimum speed for approach in a 152, not taking into consideration that the air is super turbulent. For those who don't know, when it's bumpy you should be going a little faster on approach than usual. Anyways, I'm quite close to the ground, maybe 300-400 feet, and I can hear the wind blowing over the sound of the engine. Suddenly, no wind. I had just lost 15-20 kts of almost direct headwind on final approach with absolutely no airspeed to spare. I remember my shirt sleeves looked like they were inflating and the plane's stall warning started screaming at me. The controls became totally useless, like a limp computer joystick. Thankfully I had my hand on the throttle like my instructor taught me, and for whatever instinctual reason, good instructor probably, I gently pushed the throttle all the way and slightly lowered the nose. All of this took place in the span of about 5 seconds. I remember what I did, but not thinking about doing it. It was like when you drive somewhere and you suddenly realize you've arrived without remembering driving. Dang scary. Anyways, I landed the plane just fine and went home and took a nap. My parents said I was pale as a ghost when I got home. Flying is fun until it isn't. A lot of people are wondering why I gently pushed the throttle in. The reason is because the carburetor can't provide enough fuel to maintain the proper fuel-air mixture. When the pilot rapidly pushes the throttle in, the carb is supposed to provide a quick squirt of fuel to account for the rapid increase in air. If the pilot slams the throttle to the firewall, The huge amount of air coming into the carb is simply too much for it to maintain the proper air-fuel mixture, even with the extra squirt. In the best case, this can cause the engine to lag for a few seconds while the mixture catches up, and in the worst case might actually cause the engine to stall completely. So imagine an inexperienced pilot who panics and really jams the throttle all the way. That may have a disastrous effect because not only are they at low altitude with little airspeed, but they just choke their engine and simply can't get more power. Was learning to fly when I worked for the governor, so on my first flight with me taking off, we've been climbing for about 5 minutes and we're going through some gentle turns when instructor says, "We're going to head back, I don't feel well." He takes over the stick and he looks ashen. He then starts to breath erratically and says I need to help him control the plane. He radios tower and up till now I'm thinking it's a prank. Mayday, mayday. He talks me through the whole thing. I'm trying to talk to the tower, repeat info, read gauges, remember lessons, listen to him and hope he don't pass out. I was crapping myself. Takeoff is one thing, but landing? We land like a kangaroo with a rocket up its butt. I'm surprised the wheels didn't fold. Must have been 4 big bounces, but it's a big runway. Scrub speed. Finally get the plane to stop and instructor passes out. He had a heart attack. He survived but only for a few months before I heard he passed away in his sleep. But he got us down. I never continued the lessons. We land like a kangaroo with a rocket up its butt. Holy heck, that's the funniest thing I've read all week. Not completely on topic, but I was an aircraft mechanic for the Navy back in the day on A4 Skyhawks. Student pilot notices his canopy light is on, indicating his canopy isn't all the way closed and locked. He decided it might help if he cracked the canopy open just a little bit and close it again. I remember seeing it land as a convertible. We sent a couple of guys out in a pickup truck where they found the missing canopy in a farmer's field. This entire story occurred in less than 10 seconds and should have ended with headlines on CNN. Military pilot and not commercial, but it still could have ended in a disaster. Flying a CH-47D Chinook helicopter in Iraq mid-July 2008 when the temp was over 130 degrees. Packed full with 36 passengers at an altitude of only 100 feet and speed of 140 knots. Lower and faster than you'd ever fly in the US. We hit a thermal pocket of warm air that pushed us up, so I nosed the cyclic. Looks like a joystick between your legs. Forward to maintain altitude. I was a brand new pilot flying with a combat vet who wanted me to maintain altitude of 100 feet almost exactly, so no higher than 120 or lower than 80 feet. Nosing the aircraft down kept us from going higher, but we immediately hit a downdraft and the aircraft started to fall like a rock. I pulled back on the cyclic as hard as I could to get the nose up, but it hit my body armor and wouldn't go back any further. I watched the altimeter drop all the way to 19 feet and miraculously we started falling and began to climb at the last possible second. During the debrief, the other pilot, now one of my closest friends, who had well over 1,000 combat hours, told me he's never been so close to dying before. I wasn't shook up until I heard that. Even typing this today gives me chills. Freaking body armor, man. That crap gets in the way of everything. Once, departing Burning Man in a private plane with a couple of passengers, my engine conked out. I didn't even follow the engine out checklist. I glanced at the fuel pressure gauge, didn't like what I saw, hit the switch for the auxiliary fuel pump, and it came back to life. The whole incident was over so fast the passengers never even noticed. I wouldn't call it a we're all frick moment, though. Worst case scenario, I would have had to set it back down on the playa, which is pretty flat terrain as far as the eye can see. Redundancy high five. Not a pilot but a passenger, was on a 16-seater turboprop when suddenly there's a loud bang. All the lights go out, and we drop. We're all looking around like what's going on? Is this how we die? After a few minutes the lights come back on and the pilot comes in, the PA says sorry about that folks, but we were just struck by lightning. No need to worry, everything seems to be working. Except for the radar, it's fried. I may have worried a little. Believe it or not, that actually happens pretty regularly. It's usually not a big deal. Planes are designed with that in mind. I'm a commercial helicopter pilot. Probably the closest moments to where fricked I ever had was a few years ago. To set it up, I was ferrying a helicopter by myself to another location about 200 miles away. The helicopter I was flying was set up for IFR, instrument flying, and I'm a fairly experienced IFR captain. The helicopter I was in does not like ice. That means that flying in the clouds when it's below freezing is basically impossible. This was in the high Arctic, in the early spring, so basically always cold. Weather wasn't great, but I still wanted to give the trip a shot. If it was bad, I would just turn around and come home. About 50 miles out, the cloud ceiling was coming down, and visibility was dropping. I was over a small frozen lake, and I could see at the other end of the lake that the clouds were right to the ground. At this point I'm at about 300 feet above ground. I make the call to turn around and start the left-hand turn, but as I'm halfway through the turn I enter cloud. Under normal circumstances, a VFR helicopter unintentionally entering cloud is often a death sentence, but I'm a trained IFR pilot in an IFR helicopter. I start to climb, as I know there is rising terrain on the side of the lake. I don't mind flying in cloud. What I do mind is the fact that my helicopter starts icing up instantly. I'm not talking about a bit of ice. I'm talking about a massive amount of ice. In a helicopter that doesn't like any ice, there is no way I can make it the 50 miles back to the airport to shoot an IFR approach. And I know the clouds are too thick to climb above them. I also can't descend because the ceiling is so low that I risk impacting the terrain if I don't pop out of the cloud soon enough. I'm running through the options in my head, but my heart rate is going up. This isn't something that normally happens. I'm not the type of pilot that gets into situations that scare me. I'm rapidly running out of time, so I head to a larger flat area, as indicated on my GPS and maps. Set my radio altimeter, a device that tells you exactly how far above the ground you are, to beep at me when I reach 250 feet, and start descending. I figure if I don't break out by 300 feet, I'm in some serious trouble. As I'm approaching 300 feet, I break out of cloud. Good visibility, and a clear path all the way back to the airport. I do a normal approach and landing, and shut down at our hangar. The blades are covered in ice. After I change my underwear, we pull the helicopter into the hangar to let the ice thaw. The next day, the weather is beautiful, and the trip goes off without a hitch. After flying for 10 years and thousands of hours, it was the only time I was actually scared. I'm glad I didn't have any passengers on board at the time. Commercial pilot here. Not the most exciting story, but because there aren't any good ones yet I'll reply. I was flying myself and 3 passengers over the Appalachian Mountain on a clear day. We hit some mild turbulence and the door opened to the cabin. The passengers all started panicking, so I basically said, "Chill out guys, this happens all the time," and tried closing the door. I couldn't get it shut while also flying the plane, so I simply landed at a nearby airfield and closed it on the ground. After the trip was over, I told the passengers that was the first time that had ever happened to me, and I was slightly panicked as well. That's quite handy if you need to reverse after taking a wrong turning during the flight or something. This was about 7 years ago now. I took my brother and 2 cousins up for a short sightseeing flight one morning in a Cessna 172. I knew there was some weather coming in, so I wanted to get it over with quickly. About 20 minutes in, I noticed the clouds getting worse and then some lightning off in the distance. Definitely time to head back. Heading back, I radioed my intentions. Uncontrolled airport but with info, and someone radioed back with the current winds. It didn't compute what they said, and in retrospect I should have asked for clarification. Get back to the airport, and as I'm on final I realize just how bad the wind is. Having a hard time keeping on center line and eventually go around on the first try. By now I'm starting to sweating bullets and planning on rerouting if the next attempt doesn't go well. I make sure to turn the intercom off so my cousins in the back can't hear how panicked I'm becoming, though I did keep my cool through the whole thing. On second attempt I've got the rudder pegged to the left and managed to get the wheels on the ground safely. I taxi to park, shut down, jump out, and start shaking with adrenaline and let out a huge sigh of relief. Cousins had no idea what just happened. It was just an exciting flight to them. My brother kind of knew what was going on, and I let him in on what I was thinking later. Apparently I had an audience of guys from the FBO watching me as well, probably yelling at me to go somewhere else. I'm honestly surprised sometimes I managed that landing with no incidents, especially since that was basically my first crosswind landing. Long time ago, back in 1989 I was a first officer on the 747-100. We pushed back from the terminal in Anchorage and taxied out for a departure to Narita, Tokyo. We were full of people and very close to max takeoff weight. At the end of the runway, it was my takeoff. I stood on the brakes, stood the thrust levers up and the engineer set full takeoff power, released the brakes and off we trundled, and we rolled, and rolled down the runway. It was not sparkling acceleration by any means, as the end of the runway loomed into sight and takeoff speed still some distance away, with the lights going. Red white red white red red red, the captain said, and I quote, "Best you rotate." We were a good 20 kts below VR. Not being a total numpty, I slowly and smoothly rotated and the beast flew away off the end of the runway like a lady. We slowly climbed away, cleaned up, turned and headed out west. Not a word was said for a long while. Finally through 20,000 feet the engineer launched himself at the my performance figures. Nothing was wrong, and we were at full power anyway. It turned out that extra cargo had been loaded in error, and we were well overweight. Apart from me wetting the seat and a raised heart rate, the passengers were none the wiser. As a fellow airline pilot I appreciate red white red white red red red. That's about the time you're trying to push the throttles through the instrument panel and your sphincter is gathering up the seat cushion. Not quite with passengers but different nonetheless. During my first solo flight ever, I was really excited and wanted to video record the special occasion. So there I was, taxiing down the taxiway with one hand holding my phone. One thing about old propeller planes is that they're just like old cars, and don't always drive straight. I suppose I was a little too concentrated on making sure my camera was properly angled and focused. Next thing I knew my plane ended up rolling off the asphalt, into the fricking grassy ditch. I panicked. How TF am I supposed to get this plane out of here? Over the radio, there was a silence, as the controller likely saw what happened from the tower. After a few seconds, probably still speechless at this point, she casually checked on me to make sure I was doing okay. To save my embarrassment, I tried to power up and drive out of the grass back to the asphalt. Much to my surprise, it worked. I did my short flying as planned and returned to the hangar where my instructor was waiting. I have no idea how many people saw what happened, but from the look on his face, I'm pretty sure he knew too. And yes, that video of me driving a plane into a ditch still exists somewhere. I suppose this is the airplane equivalent of don't text and drive. Instructor was thinking no harm done, and you will never make that mistake again. Not a pilot but my buddy has a private license, and we fly together often, just for his hours. I buy lunch, he gets ours. It's fun. I live in the PNW and wanted to fly over Crater Lake one winter. Ceiling 8,000 featuring, Crater Lake 6,000 featuring. He doesn't have his instrumental yet, so we can't break ceiling. We fly over, have an easy time, take great pics, etc. We get back to the airport, go to the bar, and he proceeded to tell me that was the most frightened he's ever been piloting. Why? The single engine Cessna we were in could glide 2-3 miles in an emergency. The Crater Lake is 8+ miles in diameter. In the middle, we'd be fricked. I asked him what he would do. He said, I'd nosedive into the water. You want to swim in that crap and drown, or die quick and mostly painless FML. I don't like making open water crossings outside of gliding distance in the C-172 I fly. Glide ratio is 9:1, which roughly translates to 1.5 nm 1000 feet in altitude. If I'm crossing a 6 nm lake, I'll want to be at 2000 feet at least. I've been looking for an explanation from a pilot to the experience I had on an Embraer 145J from Newark to Albany one afternoon. I've been on a lot of flights, especially that little hop, many times. I know what the normal sounds are, including when it sounds like the engine's cut out and it feels like some hit the brakes. This was different. We took off like normal, but about a minute into the climb, the plane went dead silent and we went into an abrupt nosedive for 3-5 seconds, which felt like eternity. At least 7 people screamed. I clutched my armrest and made peace with that fact that this was finally happening. I always knew I would die in a plane crash. Miraculously, the engine suddenly kicked back in and we went right back into a sharp climb. 5 seconds after, the exact same thing happened to us again. The plane's engines went silent, and we were pointing hard back at the earth. More people screamed this time, and it was louder than the first time. Again, the engines turned on and we got up to cruising altitude, but the whole flight was shaky. It felt slow. It really felt like we were about to drop out of the sky. There was a woman from Long Island in front of me nervously talking to everybody, saying things like, "My mother would say he's acting like a hotshot." We landed in Albany with no explanation as to what happened. Most pilots I've ever asked shake their head in confusion, unsure what could have happened. One explanation was that there's a mandatory noise abatement protocol over certain neighborhoods in Newark. Oftentimes they'll get clearance to not back the engines off. Possibly in this case, the pilots thought he would get the clearance. Air traffic peeps said no, and made the pilot back off and drop back down to a certain altitude. And they did that in the worst way possible for non-pilot passengers. This sounds like balls to me, but it's all I have. This experience traumatized me a little bit, so a real explanation would be great. It could have been an altitude bust, so ATC issues the pilots a climb to 6,000 feet and the pilots realize they've climbed to 6,500 feet and not wanting to get a call from the company they tried to dive to the altitude without ATC finding out. Maybe. It's happened to me, but I was flying boxes. SHHHH. If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video. Bye for now.